Martian Time-Slip by Philip K. Dick. Copyright 1964 by Philip K. Dick. Copyright renewed 1992 by Laura Coelho, Christopher Dick, and Isa Hackett. This unabridged recording of the reading of Martian Time-Slip was published by arrangement with Scoville Chichak Galen Literary Agency and was produced in 1998 by Blackstone Audiobooks, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Audiobooks. This book is read by Tom Parker. This book is 262 pages long. The following material appears on the book's back cover. On the arid colony of Mars, the only thing more precious than water may be a 10-year-old schizophrenic boy named Manfred Steiner. For although the UN has slated anomalous children for deportation and destruction, other people, especially Supreme Good Member Arnie Cott of the Water Workers Union, suspect that Manfred's disorder may be a window into the future. But what sort of future? And what happens to those unfortunates whom Manfred ushers into it? In Martian Time-Slip, Philip K. Dick, the incomparable genius of speculative fiction, uses power politics and extraterrestrial real estate scams, adultery and murder to penetrate the mysteries of being and time. Dedication to Mark and Jody. Chapter 1. From the depths of phenobarbital slumber, Sylvia Bolin heard something that called. Sharp, it broke the layers into which she had sunk, damaging her perfect state of non-self. "Mom!" her son called again from outdoors. Sitting up, she took a swallow of water from the glass by the bed. She put her bare feet on the floor and rose with difficulty. Time by the clock, 9:30. She found her robe, walked to the window. I must not take any more of that, she thought. Better to succumb to the schizophrenic process, join the rest of the world. She raised the window shade. The sunlight, with its familiar reddish-dusty tinge, filled her sight and made it impossible to see. She put up her hand, calling, "What is it, David?" "Mom, the ditch rider's here." Then this must be Wednesday. She nodded, turned, and walked unsteadily from the bedroom to the kitchen, where she managed to put on the good, solid, earth-made coffee pot. What must I do? She asked herself. All's ready for him. David will see anyhow. She turned on the water at the sink and splashed her face. The water, unpleasant and tainted, made her cough. We should drain the tank, she thought. Scour it, adjust the chlorine flow, and see how many of the filters are plugged. Perhaps all. Couldn't the ditch rider do that? No, not the UN's business. "Do you need me?" she asked, opening the back door. The air swirled at her, cold and choked with the fine sand. She averted her head and listened for David's answer. He was trained to say no. "I guess not," the boy grumbled. Later, as she sat in her robe at the kitchen table drinking coffee, her plate of toast and applesauce before her, she looked out on the sight of the ditch rider arriving in his little flat-bottomed boat, which putt-putted up the canal in its official way, never hurrying and yet always arriving on schedule. This was 1994, the second week in August. They had waited 11 days, and now they would receive their share of water from the great ditch which passed by their line of houses a mile to the Martian north. The ditch rider had moored his boat at the sluice gate and was hopping up onto dry land, encumbered with his ringed binder, in which he kept his records, and his tools for switching the gate. He wore a gray uniform spattered with mud, high boots almost brown from the dried silt. German? But he was not. When the man turned his head, she saw that his face was flat and Slavic, and that in the center of the visor of his cap was a red star. It was the Russian's turn this time. She had lost track. And she evidently was not the only one who had lost track of the sequence of rotation by the managing UN authorities. For now she saw that the family from the next house, the Steiners, had appeared on their front porch and were preparing to approach the ditch rider. All 6 of them, father and heavy-set mother, and the 4 blonde, round, noisy Steiner girls. It was the Steiners' water which the rider was now turning off. "Bitte, mein Herr," Norbert Steiner began, but then he too saw the red star and became silent. To herself, Sylvia smiled. Too bad, she thought. Opening the back door, David hurried into the house. "Mom, you know what? The Steiners' tank sprang a leak last night, and around half their water drained out." So they don't have enough water stored up for their garden, and it'll die, Mr. Steiner says. She nodded as she ate her last bit of toast. She lit a cigarette. Isn't that terrible, Mom? David said. Sylvia said, and the Steiners want him to leave their water on just a little longer. We can't let their garden die. Remember all the trouble we had with our beets? And Mr. Steiner gave us that chemical from home that killed the beetles, and we were going to give them some of our beets, but we never did. We forgot. That was true. She recalled with a guilty start. We did promise them. And they've never said anything, even though they must remember. And David is always over there playing. Please go out and talk to the rider, David begged. She said, I guess we could give them some of our water later on in the month. We could run a hose over to their garden. But I don't believe them about the leak. They always want more than their share. I know, David said, hanging his head. They don't deserve more, David. No one does. They just don't know how to keep their property going right, David said. Mr. Steiner, he doesn't know anything about tools. Then that's their responsibility. She felt irritable, and it occurred to her that she was not fully awake. She needed a Dexamil, or her eyes would never be open, not until it was nightfall once more and time for another phenobarbital. Going to the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, she got down the bottle of small green heart-shaped pills, opened it, and counted. She had only 23 left, and soon she would have to board the big tractor bus and cross the desert to town to visit the pharmacy for a refill. From above her head came a noisy, echoing gurgle. The tank on the roof, their huge tin water storage tank, had begun to fill. The ditch rider had finished switching the sluice gate. The pleas of the Steiners had been in vain. Feeling more and more guilty, she filled a glass with water in order to take her morning pill. If only Jack were home more, she said to herself. It's so empty around here. It's a form of barbarism, this pettiness we're reduced to. What's the point of all this bickering and tension, this terrible concern over each drop of water that dominates our lives? There should be something more. We were promised so much in the beginning. Loudly, from a nearby house, the racket of a radio blared up suddenly. Dance music, and then an announcer giving a commercial for some sort of farm machinery. Depth and angle of the furrow, the voice declared, echoing in the cold, bright morning air. Preset and self-adjusting, so that even the most unskilled owner can, almost the first time. Dance music returned. The people had turned to a different station. The squabble of children rose up. Is it going to be like this all day? She asked herself, wondering if she could face it. And Jack, away until the weekend at his job, it was almost like not being married, like not having a man. Did I emigrate from Earth for this? She clapped her hands to her ears, trying to shut out the noise of radios and children. I ought to be back in bed. That's where I belong, she thought, as she at last resumed dressing for the day which lay ahead of her. In his employer's office in downtown Bunchwood Park, Jack Boland talked on the radio telephone to his father in New York City. The contact, made through a system of satellites over millions of miles of space, was none too good as always, but Leo Boland was paying for the call. What do you mean, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Mountains? Jack said loudly. You must be mistaken, Dad. There's nothing there. It's a total waste area. Anybody in real estate can tell you that. His father's faint voice came. No, Jack, I believe it's sound. I want to come out and have a look and discuss it with you. How's Sylvia and the boy? Fine, Jack said. But listen, don't commit yourself, because it's a known fact that any Mars real estate away from the part of the canal network that works, and remember that only about 1/10 of it works, comes close to being an outright fraud. He could not understand how his father, with his years of business experience, especially in investments in unimproved land, could have gotten onto such a bum steer. It frightened him. Maybe his dad, in the years since he had seen him, had gotten old. Letters told very little. His dad dictated them to one of his company stenographers. Or perhaps time flowed differently on Earth than on Mars. He had read an article in a psychology journal suggesting that. His father would arrive a tottering, white-haired old relic. Was there any way to get out of the visit? David would be glad to see his grandfather, and Sylvia liked him too. In Jack Boland's ear, the faint, distant voice related news of New York City, none of any interest. It was unreal to Jack. A decade ago, he had made a terrific effort to detach himself from his community on Earth, and he had succeeded. He did not want to hear about it. And yet the link with his father remained, and it would be shored up in a little while by his father's first trip off Earth. He had always wanted to visit another planet before it was too late, before his death, in other words. Leo was determined. But despite improvements in the big interplan ships, travel was hazardous. That did not bother him. Nothing would deter him. He had already made reservations, in fact. "Gosh, Dad," Jack said, "it sure is wonderful that you feel able to make such an arduous trip. I hope you're up to it." He felt resigned. Across from him, his employer, Mr. Yi, regarded him and held up a slip of yellow paper on which was written a service call. Skinny, elongated Mr. Yi in his bow tie and single-breasted suit, the Chinese style of dress rigorously rooted here on alien soil, as authentic as if Mr. Yi did business in downtown Canton. Mr. Yi pointed to the slip and then solemnly acted out its meaning. He shivered, poured from left hand to right, then mopped his forehead and tugged at his collar. Then he inspected the wristwatch on his bony wrist. A refrigeration unit on some dairy farm had broken down, Jack Boland understood, and it was urgent. The milk would be ruined as the day's heat increased. "Okay, Dad," he said, "we'll be expecting your wire." He said goodbye and hung up. "Sorry to be on the phone so long," he said to Mr. Yi. He reached for the slip. "An elderly person should not make the trip here," Mr. Yi said in his placid, implacable voice. "He's made up his mind to see how we're doing," Jack said. "And if you are not doing as well as he would wish, can he help you?" Mr. Yi smiled with contempt. "Are you supposed to have struck it rich? Tell him there are no diamonds. The UN got them. As to the call which I gave you, that refrigeration unit, according to the file, was worked on by us 2 months ago for the same complaint. It is in the power source or conduit. At unpredictable times, the motor slows until the safety switch cuts it off to keep it from burning out." "I'll see what else they have drawing power from their generator," Jack said. It was hard working for Mr. Yi, he thought as he went upstairs to the roof where the company's copters were parked. Everything was conducted on a rational basis. Mr. Yi looked and acted like something put together to calculate. 6 years ago, at the age of 22, he had calculated that he could operate a more profitable business on Mars than on Earth. There was a crying need on Mars for service maintenance on all sorts of machinery, on anything with moving parts, since the cost of shipping new units from Earth was so great. An old toaster, thoughtlessly scrapped on Earth, would have to be kept working on Mars. Mr. Yi had liked the idea of salvaging. He did not approve of waste, having been reared in the frugal, puritanical atmosphere of People's China. And being an electrical engineer in Honan Province, he possessed training. So in a very calm and methodical way, he had come to a decision which for most people meant a catastrophic emotional wrenching. He had made arrangements to emigrate from Earth, exactly as he would have gone about visiting a dentist for a set of stainless steel dentures. He knew to the last UN dollar how far he could cut his overhead, once he had set up shop on Mars. It was a low-margin operation, but extremely professional. In the 6 years since 1988, he had expanded until now his repairmen held priority in cases of emergency. And what, in a colony which still had difficulty growing its own radishes and cooling its own tiny yield of milk, was not an emergency. Shutting the copter door, Jack Boland started up the engine, and soon was rising above the buildings of Bunchwood Park into the hazy, dull sky of mid-morning on his first service call of the day. Far to his right, an enormous ship, completing its trip from Earth, was settling down onto the circle of basalt which was the receiving field for living cargoes. Other cargoes had to be delivered 100 miles to the east. This was a first-class carrier, and shortly it would be visited by remote-operated devices which would fleece the passengers of every virus and bacteria, insect and weed seed adhering to them. They would emerge as naked as the day they were born, pass through chemical baths, sputter resentfully through 8 hours of tests, and then at last be set free to see about their personal survival, the survival of the colony having been assured. Some might even be sent back to Earth, those whose condition implied genetic defects revealed by the stress of the trip. Jack thought of his dad patiently enduring the immigration processing. "Has to be done, my boy," his dad would say. "Necessary." The old man, smoking his cigar and meditating. A philosopher whose total formal education consisted of 7 years in the New York public school system, and during its most feral period. Strange, he thought, how character shows itself. The old man was in touch with some level of knowledge which told him how to behave, not in the social sense, but in a deeper, more permanent way. He'll adjust to this world here, Jack decided. In his short visit, he'll come to terms better than Sylvia and I, about as David has. They would get along well, his father and his boy, both shrewd and practical, and yet both haphazardly romantic, as witness his father's impulse to buy land somewhere in the FDR mountains. It was a last gasp of hope springing eternal in the old man. Here was land selling for next to nothing, with no takers, the authentic frontier which the habitable parts of Mars were patently not. Below him, Jack noted the Senator Taft Canal and aligned his flight with it. The canal would lead him to the McAuliffe Dairy Ranch, with its thousands of acres of withered grass, its once prize herd of Jerseys, now bent into something resembling their ancestors by the unjust environment. This was habitable Mars, this almost fertile spiderweb of lines, radiating and crisscrossing, but always barely adequate to support life, no more. The Senator Taft, directly below now, showed a sluggish and repellent green. It was water sluiced and filtered in its final stages, but here it showed the accretions of time, the underlying slime and sand and contaminants which made it anything but potable. God knew what alkalines the population had absorbed and built into its bones by now. However, they were alive. The water had not killed them, yellow-brown and full of sediment as it was, while over to the west, the reaches which were waiting for human science to rear back and pass its miracle. The archaeological teams which had landed on Mars early in the 70s had eagerly plotted the stages of retreat of the old civilization which human beings had now begun to replace. It had not at any time settled in the desert proper. Evidently, as with the Tigris and Euphrates civilization on Earth, it had clung to what it could irrigate. At its peak, the old Martian culture had occupied a fifth of the planet's surface, leaving the rest as it had found it. Jack Boland's house, for instance, near the junction of the William Butler Yeats Canal with the Herodotus. It stood almost at the edge of the network by which fertility had been attained for the past 5,000 years. The Bolands were latecomers, although no one had known 11 years ago that emigration would fall off so startlingly. The radio in the copter made static noises, and then a tinny version of Mr. Yee's voice said, "Jack, I have a service call for you to add. The UN Authority says that the public school is malfunctioning and their own man is unavailable." Picking up the microphone, Jack said into it, "I'm sorry, Mr. Yee. As I thought I'd told you, I'm not trained to touch those school units. You'd better have Bob or Pete handle that." "As I know I told you," he said to himself. In his logical way, Mr. Yee said, "This repair is vital, and therefore we can't turn it down, Jack. We have never turned down any repair job. Your attitude is not positive. I will have to insist that you tackle the job. As soon as it is possible, I will have another repairman out to the school to join you. Thank you, Jack." Mr. Yee rang off. "Thank you, too," Jack Boland said acidly to himself. Below him now he saw the beginnings of a second settlement. This was Lewistown, the main habitation of the Plumbers' Union colony, which had been one of the first to be organized on the planet, and which had its own union members as its repairmen. It did not patronize Mr. Yee. If his job became too unpleasant, Jack Boland could always pack up and migrate to Lewistown, join the union, and go to work at perhaps an even better salary. But recent political events in the Plumbers' Union colony had not been to his liking. Arnie Cott, president of the Water Workers Local, had been elected only after much peculiar campaigning and some more than average balloting irregularities. His regime did not strike Jack as the sort he wanted to live under. From what he had seen of it, the old man's rule had all the elements of early Renaissance tyranny, with a bit of nepotism thrown in. And yet the colony appeared to be prospering economically. It had an advanced public works program, and its fiscal policies had brought into existence an enormous cash reserve. The colony was not only efficient and prosperous, it was also able to provide decent jobs for all its inhabitants. With the exception of the Israeli settlement to the north, the Union colony was the most viable on the planet. And the Israeli settlement had the advantage of possessing die-hard Zionist shock units, encamped on the desert proper, engaged in reclamation projects of all sorts, from growing oranges to refining chemical fertilizers. Alone, New Israel had reclaimed a third of all the desert land now under cultivation. It was, in fact, the only settlement on Mars which exported its produce back to Earth in any quantity. The Waterworkers' Union capital city of Lewistown passed by, and then the monument to Alger Hiss, the first UN martyr. Then open desert followed. Jack sat back and lit a cigarette. Under Mr. Yee's prodding scrutiny, he had left without remembering to bring his thermos of coffee, and he now felt its lack. He felt sleepy. "They won't get me to work on the public school," he said to himself, but with more anger than conviction. "I'll quit." But he knew he wouldn't quit. He would go to the school, tinker with it for an hour or so, giving the impression of being busy repairing, and then Bob or Pete would show up and do the job. The firm's reputation would be preserved, and they could go back to the office. Everyone would be satisfied, including Mr. Yee. Several times he had visited the public school with his son. That was different. David was at the top of his class, attending the most advanced teaching machines along the route. He stayed late, making the most of the tutorial system of which the UN was so proud. Looking at his watch, Jack saw that it was 10 o'clock. At this moment, as he recalled from his visits and from his son's accounts, David was with the Aristotle, learning the rudiments of science, philosophy, logic, grammar, poetics, and an archaic physics. Of all the teaching machines, David seemed to derive the most from the Aristotle, which was a relief. Many of the children preferred the more dashing teachers at the school, Sir Francis Drake, English history, fundamentals of masculine civility, or Abraham Lincoln, United States history, basics of modern warfare and the contemporary state, or such grim personages as Julius Caesar and Winston Churchill. He himself had been born too soon to take advantage of the tutorial school system. He had gone to classes as a boy where he sat with 60 other children, and later in high school he had found himself listening and watching an instructor speaking over closed-circuit TV, along with a class of 1,000. If, however, he had been allowed into the new school, he could readily have located his own favorite. On a visit with David, on the first parent-teacher day, in fact, he had seen the Thomas Edison teaching machine, and that was enough for him. It took David almost an hour to drag his father away. Below the copter, the desert land gave way to sparse, prairie-like grassland. A barbed wire fence marked the beginning of the McAuliffe Ranch, and with it the area administered by the state of Texas. McAuliffe's father had been a Texas oil millionaire and had financed his own ships for the emigration to Mars. He had beaten even the Plumbers Union people. Jack put out his cigarette and began to lower the copter, searching against the glare of the sun for the buildings of the ranch. A small herd of cows panicked and galloped off at the noise of the copter. He watched them scatter, hoping that McAuliffe, who was a short, dour-faced Irishman with an obsessive attitude toward life, hadn't noticed. McAuliffe, for good reasons, had a hypochondriacal view of his cows. He suspected that all manner of Martian things were out to get them, to make them lean, sick, and fitful in their milk production. Turning on his radio transmitter, Jack said into the microphone, "This is a Yee Company repair ship. Jack Boland asking permission to land on the McAuliffe Strip in answer to your call." He waited, and then there came the answer from the huge ranch. "Okay, Boland, all clear. No use asking what took you so long." McAuliffe's resigned, grumpy voice. "Be there any minute now," Jack said with a grimace. Presently he made out the buildings ahead, white against the sand. "We've got 15,000 gallons of milk here," McAuliffe's voice came from the radio speaker. "And it's all going to spoil unless you get this damned refrigeration unit going soon." "On the double," Jack said. He put his thumbs in his ears and leered a grotesque, repudiating face at the radio speaker. Chapter 2. The X Plumber, Supreme Good Member Arnie Cott of the Water Workers Local, 4th Planet Branch, rose from his bed at 10 in the morning and, as was his custom, strolled directly to the steam bath. "Hello, Gus." "Hi there, Arnie." Everybody called him by his first name, and that was good. Arnie Cott nodded to Bill and Eddie and Tom, and they all greeted him. The air, full of steam, condensed around his feet and drained off across the tiles to be voided. That was a touch which pleased him. The baths had been constructed so as not to preserve the runoff. The water drained out onto the hot sand and disappeared forever. Who else could do that? He thought, let's see if those rich Jews up in New Israel have a steam bath that wastes water. Placing himself under a shower, Arnie Cott said to the fellows around him, "I heard some rumor I want checked on as soon as possible. You know that combine from California? Those Portuguese that originally held title on the FDR mountain range, and they tried to extract iron ore there, but it was too low grade and the cost was way out of line? I heard they sold their holdings." "Yeah, I heard that too." All the boys nodded. I wonder how much they lost. Must have taken a terrible beating. Arnie said, No, I heard they found a buyer that was willing to put up more than they paid. They made a profit after all these years. So it paid them to hold out. I wonder who's nuts enough to want that land. I got some mineral rights there, you know. I want you to check into who bought that land and what kind of operation they represent. I want to know what they're doing over there. Good to know those things. Again, everyone nodded, and one man, Fred it looked like, detached himself from his shower and padded off to dress. I'll check into that, Arnie, Fred said over his shoulder. I'll get to it right away. Addressing himself to the remaining men, Arnie soaped himself all over and said, You know, I got to protect my mineral rights. I can't have some smoozer coming in here from Earth and making those mountains into, like, for instance, a national park for picnickers. I'll tell you what I heard. I know that a bunch of communist officials from Russia and Hungary, big boys, was over here around a week ago, no doubt looking around. You think because that collective of theirs failed last year they gave up? No. They got the brains of bugs, and like bugs they always come back. Those Reds are aching to establish a successful collective on Mars. It's practically a wet dream of theirs back home. I wouldn't be surprised if we find out that those Portuguese from California sold to communists, and pretty soon we're seeing the name changed from the FDR Mountains, which is right and proper, to something like the Joe Stalin Mountains. The men all laughed appreciatively. Now, I got a lot of business ahead of me today to conduct, Arnie said, washing the soap suds from him with furious streams of hot water. So I can't devote myself to this matter any further. I'm relying on you to dig into it. For example, I've been traveling east where we got that melon experiment in progress, and it seems like we're about to be entirely successful in inducing the New England type of melon into growing here in this environment. I know you all have been wondering about that because everybody likes a good slice of cantaloupe in the morning for his breakfast, if it's at all possible. That's true, Arnie, the boys agreed. But, Arnie said, I got more on my mind than melons. We had one of those UN boys visiting us the other day, protesting our regulations concerning the niggers. Or maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I should talk like the UN boys and say indigenous population remnants, or just bleakmen. What he had reference to was our licensing the mines owned by our settlement to use bleakmen at below scale, below the minimum wage, because even those fairies at the UN don't seriously propose we pay scale to bleakmen niggers. However, we have this problem that we can't pay any minimum wage to the bleakmen niggers because their work is so inconsistent that we go broke, and we have to use them in mining operations because they're the only ones who can breathe down there, and we can't get oxygen equipment in quantity transported over here at any price less than outrageous. Somebody's making a lot of money back home on those oxygen tanks and compressors and all that. It's a racket, and we're not going to get gouged, I can tell you. Everybody nodded somberly. Now, we can't allow the UN bureaucrats to dictate to us how we'll run our settlement, Arnie said. We set up operations here before the UN was anything here but a flag planted in the sand. We had houses built before they had a pot to piss in anywhere on Mars, including all that disputed area in the south between the US and France. Right, Arnie, the boys all agreed. However, Arnie said, there's the problem that those UN fruits control the waterways, and we gotta have water. We need them for conveyance into and out of the settlement and for source of power and to drink and, like now, like we're here bathing. Those buggers can cut off our water any time. They got us by the short hairs. He finished his shower and padded across the warm, wet tiles to get a towel from the attendant. Thinking about the UN made his stomach rumble, and his one-time duodenal ulcer began to burn way down in his left side, almost at the groin. Better get some breakfast, he realized. When he had been dressed by the attendant in his gray flannel trousers and T-shirt, soft leather boots, and nautical cap, he left the steam bath and crossed the corridor of the Union Hall to his dining room, where Helio, his bleakman cook, had his breakfast waiting. Shortly, he sat before a stack of hot cakes and bacon, coffee, and a glass of orange juice, and the previous week's New York Times, the Sunday edition. "Good morning, Mr. Cott." In answer to his button-pressing, a secretary from the pool had appeared, a girl he had never seen before. Not too good-looking, he decided after a brief glance. He returned to reading the newspaper. And calling him Mr. Cott, too. He sipped his orange juice and read about a ship that had perished in space with all 300 aboard killed. It was a Japanese merchantman carrying bicycles. That made him laugh. Bicycles in space, and all gone now. Too bad, because on a planet with little mass like Mars, where there was virtually no power source except the sluggish canal system, and where even kerosene cost a fortune, bicycles were of great economic value. A man could pedal free of cost for hundreds of miles right over the sand, too. The only people who used kerosene-powered turbine conveyances were vital functionaries, such as the repair and maintenance men, and of course important officials, such as himself. There were public transports, of course, such as the tractor buses which connected one settlement with the next and the outlying residential areas with the world at large. But they ran irregularly, being dependent on shipments from Earth for their fuel. And personally speaking, the buses gave him a sense of claustrophobia. They moved so slow. Reading the New York Times made him feel for a little while as if he were back home again, in South Pasadena. His family had subscribed to the West Coast edition of the Times, and as a boy he remembered bringing it in from the mailbox, in from the street lined with apricot trees, the warm, smoggy little street of neat one-story houses and parked cars and lawns tended from one weekend to the next without fail. It was the lawn, with all its equipment and medicines, that he missed most. The wheelbarrow of fertilizer, the new grass seed, the snippers, the poultry netting fence in the early spring, and always the sprinklers at work throughout the long summer whenever the law allowed. Water shortage there, too. Once his Uncle Paul had been arrested for washing his car on a water ration day. Reading further in the paper, he came upon an article about a reception at the White House for a Mrs. Lisner, who, as an official of the Birth Control Agency, had performed 8,000 therapeutic abortions, and had thereby set an example for American womanhood. Kind of like a nurse, Arnie Cott decided. Noble occupation for females. He turned the page. There, in big type, was a quarter-page ad which he himself had helped compose, a glowing come-on to get people to emigrate. Arnie sat back in his chair, folded the paper, felt deep pride as he studied the ad. It looked good, he decided. It would surely attract people if they had any guts at all and a sincere desire for adventure, as the ad said. The ad listed all the skills in demand on Mars, and it was a long list, excluding only canary raiser and proctologist, if that. It pointed out how hard it was now for a person with only a master's degree to get a job on Earth, and how on Mars there were good-paying jobs for people with only BAs. That ought to get them, Arnie thought. He himself had emigrated, due to his having only a BA. Every door had been shut to him, and then he had come to Mars as nothing but a union plumber. And within a few short years, look at him. On Earth, a plumber with only a BA would be raking up dead locusts in Africa as part of a U.S. foreign aid work gang. In fact, his brother Phil was doing that right now. He had graduated from the University of California and had never had a chance to practice his profession, that of milk tester. In his class, over 100 milk testers had been graduated, and for what? There were no opportunities on Earth. You have to come to Mars, Arnie said to himself. We can use you here. Look at the pokey cows on those dairy ranches outside of town. They could use some testing. But the catch in the ad was simply that once on Mars, the emigrant was guaranteed nothing, not even the certainty of being able to give up and go home. Trips back were much more expensive, due to the inadequate field facilities. Certainly, he was guaranteed nothing in the way of employment. The fault lay with the big powers back home, China and the U.S. and Russia and West Germany. Instead of properly backing the development of the planets, they had turned their attention to further exploration. Their time and brains and money were all committed to the sidereal projects, such as that frigging flight to Centaurus, which had already wasted billions of dollars and man-hours. Arnie Cott could not see the sidereal projects for beans. Who wanted to take a 4-year trip to another solar system which maybe wasn't even there? And yet at the same time, Arnie feared a change in the attitude of the great terrestrial powers. Suppose one morning they woke up and took a new look at the colonies on Mars and Venus. Suppose they eyed the ramshackle developments there and decided something should be done about them. In other words, what became of Arnie Cott when the great powers came to their senses? It was a thought to ponder. However, the great powers showed no symptoms of rationality. Their obsessive competitiveness still governed them. Right this moment they were locking horns 2 light years away, to Arnie's relief. Reading further in the paper, he came across a brief article having to do with a women's organization in Bern, Switzerland, which had met to declare once more its anxiety about colonization. Colonial Safety Committee alarmed over conditions of Mars landing fields. The ladies, in a petition presented to the Colonial Department of the UN, had expressed once more their conviction that the fields on Mars at which ships from Earth landed were too remote from habitation and from the water system. Passengers in some cases had been required to trek over 100 miles of wasteland, and these included women and children and old people. The Colonial Safety Committee wanted the UN to pass a regulation compelling ships to land at fields within 25 miles of a major named canal. Do-gooders, Arnie Cott thought as he read the article. Probably not one of them has ever been off Earth. They just know what somebody wrote home in a letter, some aunt retiring to Mars on a pension, living on free UN land and naturally griping. And of course they also depended on their member in residence on Mars, a certain Mrs. Ann Esterhazy. She circulated a mimeographed newsletter to other public-spirited ladies throughout the settlements. Arnie received and read her newsletter, The Auditor Speaks Back, a title at which he gagged. He gagged, too, at the 1- and 2-line squibs inserted between longer articles. Pray for potable purification. Contact colony charismatic counselors and witness for water filtration we can be proud of. He could hardly make out the meaning of some of the Auditor Speaks Back articles. They were phrased in such special jargon. But evidently the newsletter had attracted an audience of devoted women who grimly took each item to heart and acted out the deeds asked of them. Right now they were undoubtedly complaining, along with the Colonial Safety Committee back on Earth, about the hazardous distances separating most of the landing fields on Mars from water sources and human habitation. They were doing their part in one of the many great fights, and in this particular case, Arnie Cott had managed to gain control of his nausea. For of the 20 or so landing fields on Mars, only one lay within 25 miles of a major canal, and that was Samuel Gomper's field, which served his own settlement. If by some chance the pressure of the Colonial Safety Committee was effective, then all incoming passenger ships from Earth would have to land at Arnie Cott's field, with the revenue received going to his settlement. It was far from accidental that Mrs. Esterhazy and her newsletter and organization on Earth were advocating a cause which would be of economic value to Arnie. Ann Esterhazy was Arnie's ex-wife. They were still good friends, and still owned jointly a number of economic ventures which they had founded or bought into during their marriage. On a number of levels they still worked together, even though on a strictly personal basis they had no common ground whatsoever. He found her aggressive, domineering, overly masculine, a tall and bony female with a long stride, wearing low-heeled shoes and a tweed coat and dark glasses, a huge leather purse slung from a strap over her shoulder. But she was shrewd and intelligent and a natural executive. As long as he did not have to see her outside of the business context, he could get along with her. The fact that Ann Esterhazy had once been his wife and that they still had financial ties was not well known. When he wanted to get in touch with her, he did not dictate a letter to one of the settlement's stenographers. Instead, he used a little encoding dictation machine which he kept in his desk, sending the reel of tape over to her by special messenger. The messenger dropped off the tape at an art object shop which Ann owned over in the Israeli settlement, and her answer, if any, was deposited the same way at the office of a cement and gravel works on the Bernard Baruch Canal, which belonged to Arnie's brother-in-law, Ed Rockingham, his sister's husband. A year ago, when Ed Rockingham had built a house for himself and Patricia and their 3 children, he had acquired the unacquirable, his own canal. He had had it built in open violation of the law for his private use, and it drew water from the great common network. Even Arnie had been outraged, but there had been no prosecution, and today the canal, modestly named after Rockingham's eldest child, carried water 80 miles out into the desert so that Pat Rockingham could live in a lovely spot and have a lawn, a swimming pool, and a fully irrigated flower garden. She grew especially large camellia bushes, which were the only ones that had survived the transplanting to Mars. All during the day, sprinklers revolved and sprayed her bushes, keeping them from drying up and dying. 12 huge camellia bushes seemed to Arnie Cott an ostentation. He did not get along well with his sister or Ed Rockingham. What did they come to Mars for, he asked himself. To live at incredible expense and effort as much as possible as they had back home on Earth. To him it was absurd. Why not remain on Earth? Mars, for Arnie, was a new place, and it meant a new life, lived with a new style. He and the other settlers, both big and small, had made in their time on Mars countless minute adjustments in a process of adaptation through so many stages that they had in fact evolved. They were new creatures now. Their children born on Mars started out like this, novel and peculiar, in some respects enigmatic to their parents. 2 of his own boys, his and Ann's, now lived in a settlement camp at the outskirts of Lewistown. When he visited them, he could not make them out. They looked toward him with bleak eyes, as if waiting for him to go away. As near as he could tell, the boys had no sense of humor. And yet they were sensitive. They could talk forever about animals and plants, the landscape itself. Both boys had pets, Martian critters that struck him as horrid. Praying mantis types of bugs as large as donkeys. The damn things were called boxers because they were often seen propped up erect and squaring off at one another in a ritual battle which generally ended up with one killing and eating the other. Bert and Ned had gotten their pet boxers trained to do manual chores of a low caliber and not to eat each other. And the things were their companions. Children on Mars were lonely, partly because there were still so few of them, and partly because Arnie did not know. The children had a large-eyed, haunted look, as if they were starved for something as yet invisible. They tended to become reclusive, if given half a chance, wandering off to poke about in the wastelands. What they brought back was worthless to themselves and to the settlements, a few bones or relics of the old nigger civilization, perhaps. When he flew by copter, Arnie always spotted some isolated children, one here and another there, toiling away out in the desert, scratching at the rock and sand as if trying vaguely to pry up the surface of Mars and get underneath. Unlocking the bottom drawer of his desk, Arnie got out the little battery-powered encoding dictation machine and set it up for use. Into it, he said, "Ann, I'd like to meet with you and talk. That committee has too many women on it, and it's going the wrong way. For example, the last ad in the Times worries me because—" He broke off, for the encoding machine had grown to a stop. He poked at it, and the reels turned slowly and then once more settled back into silence. Thought it was fixed, Arnie thought angrily. Can't those jerks fix nothing? Maybe he would have to go to the black market and buy at an enormous price another. He winced at the thought. The not-too-good-looking secretary from the pool, who had been sitting quietly across from him waiting, now responded to his nod. She produced her pencil and pad and began as he dictated. "Usually," Arnie Cott said, "I can understand how hard it is to keep things running, what with no parts hardly, and the way the local weather affects metal and wiring. However, I'm fed up with asking for competent repair service on a vital item like my encoding machine. I just gotta have it, that's all. So if you guys can't keep it working, I'm going to disband you and withdraw your franchise to practice the craft of repairing within the settlement, and I'll rely on outside service for our maintenance." He nodded once more, and the girl ceased writing. "Shall I take the encoder over to the repair department, Mr. Cott?" she asked. "I'd be happy to, sir." "No," Arnie grumbled. "Just run along." As she departed, Arnie once more picked up his New York Times and again read. Back home on Earth, you could buy a new encoder for almost nothing. In fact, back home you could... Hell, look at the stuff being advertised. From old Roman coins to fur coats to camping equipment to diamonds to rocket ships to crabgrass poison. Jeez. However, his immediate problem was how to contact his ex-wife without the use of his encoder. Maybe I can just drop by and see her, Arnie said to himself. Good excuse to get out of the office. He picked up the telephone and called for a copter to be made ready up above him on the roof of the Union Hall, and then he finished off the remains of his breakfast, wiped his mouth hurriedly, and set off for the elevator. "Hi, Arnie," the copter pilot greeted him, a pleasant-faced young man from the pilot pool. "Hi, my boy," Arnie said, as the pilot assisted him into the special leather seat which he had had made at the settlement's fabric and upholstery shop. As the pilot got into the seat ahead of him, Arnie leaned back comfortably, crossed his legs, and said, "Now you just take off and I'll direct you in flight. And take it easy because I'm in no hurry. It looks like a nice day." "Real nice day," the pilot said, as the blades of the copter began to rotate. "Except for that haze over around the FDR range." They had hardly gotten into the air when the copter's loudspeaker came on.